Aircraft carrier Akagi. Flight deck, December 7th, 1941, morning. The vast Pacific stretches endlessly in all directions. Gray waves roll beneath a clouded sky. The flight deck of the Akagi pitches gently with the swell. Commander Mitsuo Genda stands alone near the island superstructure, his hands clasped behind his back. He is 37 years old, compact and intense, wearing the dark blue uniform of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His eyes track the southern horizon, where the last aircraft of the second wave have disappeared into the distance, 230 miles toward Pearl Harbor. The wind whips across the deck. The sound of the ship's engines thrums beneath everything. Genda checks his watch. 9:17 a.m. At 9:17 in the morning on December 7th, 1941, Commander Mitsuo Genda stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft disappear into the southern sky toward Pearl Harbor. Genda turns and walks toward the island, passing flight deck crews securing equipment. His face shows neither excitement nor anxiety, only focus. Genda was the principal architect of the attack plan. He had spent 11 months refining every detail, calculating every variable, preparing for every contingency. He knew the American fleet strength down to individual destroyers. He knew their aircraft inventory. He knew their defensive capabilities. He had studied reconnaissance photographs until he could draw the layout of Pearl Harbor from memory. A smaller, sparse room with a large table covered in charts, photographs, and typed reports. Genda sits with 3 other officers, all studying reconnaissance photos of Pearl Harbor spread across the table. Genda's finger traces the positions of battleships along Ford Island. For 11 months, Genda had worked with intelligence officers, operations planners, and senior commanders to perfect the attack. Every element had been examined, analyzed, refined. 7 battleships stationed along Ford Island, 2 more in dry dock. The carriers, Lexington and Enterprise, typically at sea 3 days per week, making Sunday morning the optimal strike window. One of the other officers leans forward, studying the photos intently. Genda points to various positions on the photographs, explaining his tactical approach. The Americans had approximately 300 aircraft on Oahu. Japanese planners knew their radar stations existed, but weren't integrated with command structure. Response time would be 12 to 15 minutes minimum. The first wave would suppress airfields immediately, preventing effective fighter opposition. Genda pulls another document from a stack, a typed intelligence report with official stamps and classification markings. American Pacific Fleet strength, 8 battleships, 3 carriers, 18 cruisers, 50 destroyers. Total operational personnel estimated at 47,000 sailors assigned to Pearl Harbor installations. These numbers came from months of intelligence collection, observation, and analysis. They were precise, they were detailed, they were trustworthy. Genda sets the report down with finality. The other officers nod in agreement, satisfied with the intelligence foundation supporting their operational plan. Genda and his fellow planners believed they knew exactly what they were facing. Every ship, every gun, every man. There would be no surprises. Genda sits alone at a small desk, writing in a leather-bound notebook by lamplight. The cabin is tiny, Spartan. A bunk, a locker, the desk. Nothing decorative except a photograph of Genda in flight gear standing beside an aircraft, younger, smiling. But there was one number, one single critical piece of intelligence that Genda and the entire Japanese naval intelligence apparatus had catastrophically wrong. Genda closes his notebook and picks up a bound intelligence estimate marked with red characters indicating classified material. He opens it to a specific page marked with a paper tab. The Japanese High Command estimated that by December 1943, 2 years into the war they were about to start, the United States Navy would have 13,070 officers and 296,000 enlisted men. Genda studies the numbers, his expression thoughtful but satisfied. He has no reason to doubt them. These were official estimates from the Naval Intelligence Division in Tokyo, the product of years of careful observation and analysis by experienced officers who had studied American naval practices extensively. The numbers seemed reasonable, even conservative. They accounted for American industrial capacity, but assumed realistic constraints on how fast human beings could be trained for complex technical roles. Genda makes a notation in his own notebook, copying the numbers with precise handwriting.
That number, 296,000, would inform every strategic decision Japan made over the next 2 years. It was the foundation of their entire war plan. Every tactical calculation, every strategic assumption, every risk assessment flowed from this single estimate. Genda continues making calculations in his notebook based on the personnel estimates, carrier task force requirements, maximum simultaneous operations capacity, replacement rates, projected American fleet strength by 1944. If the Americans had only 296,000 enlisted sailors by December 1943, they could field approximately 40 major combatants in the Pacific theater. They would be forced to choose between Atlantic convoy operations and Pacific Fleet operations. They couldn't do both at full strength. They would have limited ability to conduct simultaneous operations in multiple areas. They would struggle to replace combat losses quickly. Genda finishes his calculations and closes the notebook with a sense of completion. These calculations made Japan's strategy viable, achievable, winnable. Seize the resource areas of Southeast Asia in the first 6 months, establish a defensive perimeter, force the overstretched Americans to attack fortified positions where Japan had local superiority. After several costly defeats, the Americans would negotiate rather than sustain a prolonged war of attrition they couldn't afford. Genda places the intelligence report carefully in a locked drawer. He stands, stretches, and looks at the photograph on his desk, himself as a younger aviator.
The plan was sound. The intelligence was solid. Victory was possible. Genda had every reason to be confident. Genda stands watching the horizon. The clouds have begun to break, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce through and illuminate patches of the ocean in brilliant silver. An officer approaches from behind and salutes crisply. Genda turns to receive the report. At 9:35 a.m., the first reports began arriving from the attack force. 8 battleships hit. The Oklahoma had capsized. The Arizona was burning fiercely with catastrophic explosions tearing the vessel apart. Minimal fighter opposition. American casualties estimated at 2,000 to 3,000. Multiple ships destroyed or heavily damaged. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. Genda receives the report with a single nod. His face remains impassive, but there's a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. The officer withdraws. Genda remains alone on the deck, hands clasped behind his back, the wind whipping his uniform. The morning sun breaks through more clouds now, illuminating the flight deck in harsh, clear light. American naval power in the Pacific. He believed Japan had bought itself 6 months, perhaps a year, to seize the resources of Southeast Asia and establish a defensive perimeter the Americans would lack the strength to breach. He believed this because the numbers told him it was true. The Americans couldn't replace what they'd lost. They couldn't man more ships than they already had at sea. They couldn't expand fast enough to threaten Japan's planned perimeter. They couldn't sustain operations in multiple theaters simultaneously. The numbers made these conclusions absolute, mathematical, certain. The numbers told him all of this, and the numbers were wrong. Catastrophically, irredeemably, war-losingly wrong. The actual strength on that date was 219,279 officers, 120,472 officer candidates, and 2,034,343 enlisted personnel. They had miscalculated by a factor of more than 7 to 1. This was not a small intelligence error. This was not a rounding mistake or a misplaced decimal. This was a fundamental failure to understand the enemy they were fighting. And by the time Japanese intelligence discovered the truth, it was already too late to stop what was coming. The man who compiled many of these estimates was Captain Toshikazu Omai, serving in the operations section of the Naval General Staff. His responsibility was long-range planning, calculating how many ships America could man, how many task forces they could field, how long it would take them to replace combat losses. Omai was thorough, methodical, and highly competent. He examined American naval construction programs from published ship delivery schedules. He analyzed American training capacity from technical journals and attaché reports. He studied American personnel development systems, logistics capabilities, and supply infrastructure. The calculations were detailed and comprehensive. Based on personnel projections that assumed American mobilization would follow patterns similar to Japan's own expansion, planners like Omai concluded that the United States Navy could sustain approximately 40 major combatants in the Pacific theater, with limited ability to conduct simultaneous operations in multiple areas. Omai picks up another document, a translated article from an American naval journal. He reads it carefully, making notes in the margins. Japanese intelligence officers had access to extensive information about American naval practices. They received attaché reports from officers stationed in Washington and other American cities. They monitored technical publications that documented American shipbuilding programs. They analyzed captured documents and interviewed merchant sailors who had visited American ports. The Navy Department announced expansion of training facilities at Great Lakes and San Diego to accommodate increased recruit processing. Expansion consistent with gradual mobilization pattern. Estimate additional 15,000 to 20,000 annual capacity within expected parameters. The raw data was available. American technical publications openly documented training facilities and construction statistics. The information wasn't hidden or classified. But having information is not the same as understanding it. The intelligence apparatus suffered from fundamental organizational weaknesses that prevented accurate analysis. The Japanese Navy considered intelligence a secondary function, far less important than operations or command. The Navy assigned relatively few personnel to intelligence work and treated the assignment as less prestigious than combat billets or command positions. Omae files the journal article carefully in its proper place, then closes the drawer. Ambitious officers avoided intelligence assignments because they offered limited opportunities for advancement or recognition. This institutional attitude meant that warnings from intelligence officers carried little weight when they conflicted with operational plans already in motion. Omae returns to his desk. Another officer, younger, subordinate, approaches with a folder and hands it to him. The analysis of American West Coast shipyard capacity estimated maximum annual production of 35 major combat combatants across all yards, assuming single-shift operations and peacetime construction standards. Each vessel required approximately 2,000 personnel for capital ships, 300 to 400 for destroyers. Total additional manpower requirement
would be approximately 45,000 to 50,000 sailors annually, not accounting for shore establishment needs or training pipeline losses. Omae reads the report, nodding in satisfaction. He makes a notation and signs it, then hands it back to the junior officer, who bows and departs.
The conclusion was clear. The Americans could not sustain maximum production rates without either reducing manning standards significantly or expanding their trained personnel pool beyond what their current recruitment and training capacity could support. They would be forced to choose between Atlantic convoy operations and Pacific fleet operations. They could not do both at maximum capacity. Omae walks to the large wall map of the Pacific on the wall, Japan at the center, American bases scattered around the perimeter like distant stars. This assessment was incorporated into Japanese war plans at the highest levels. The entire strategy, seizing the resource areas of Southeast Asia, establishing a defensive perimeter extending from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific to the Dutch East Indies, forcing a negotiated settlement, assumed that American naval forces would be constrained by limited manpower pools. Omae's finger traces an arc across the map, the planned Japanese defensive perimeter from the Aleutians, sweeping south through the Central Pacific, then west to the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese believed they would be fighting a contained war against a numerically limited opponent who would eventually accept compromise rather than sustain a prolonged conflict. The mathematics supported this conclusion. The intelligence confirmed it. The plan was sound. In conference rooms at the highest levels of command, senior officers reviewed the intelligence assessments and incorporated them into strategic planning. The Americans could not sustain a two-ocean war with their current personnel strength. Intelligence estimates showed that by mid-1943, even with maximum mobilization, they would have fewer than 400,000 naval personnel total. This force would have to be divided between Atlantic convoy operations against German U-boats and Pacific Fleet operations against Japanese forces. They could not concentrate everything in one theater without leaving the other critically vulnerable. Their limited manpower meant they could not attack everywhere simultaneously. They would have to choose targets, concentrate forces, and leave other areas weakly defended. The defensive perimeter strategy was therefore sound. Japan would seize the southern resource area in the first 6 months, establish fortified positions at key points, and force the Americans to attack where Japan had numerical superiority and defensive advantage. Each time the Americans attacked one of these fortified positions, they would suffer costly defeats. After 2 or 3 such failures, they would accept that the price of recovering these territories exceeded any strategic benefit. They would negotiate. The logic was impeccable. The numbers supported every conclusion. The confidence level was high. Senior officers reviewed the intelligence, asked clarifying questions about American training capacity and expansion potential, and received answers that reinforced the existing assessments. They were preparing for the wrong war. They were preparing to fight an enemy that existed only in their intelligence estimates, an enemy constrained by the same limitations Japan faced, an enemy that would mobilize slowly and carefully, emphasizing quality over quantity, just as Japan did. While Japanese intelligence officers in Tokyo calculated American limitations using Japanese models and Japanese assumptions, American recruiting officers were processing applicants at rates Japanese planners couldn't imagine. Recruiting officers stamp forms, hand out travel orders, and process the steady stream of young men. Each transaction takes less than 5 minutes. The line moves constantly. Not hundreds, not thousands, tens of thousands every week, then hundreds of thousands every month. The scale was unprecedented in naval history. Vast training facilities stretching for miles. thousands of recruits in white uniforms march in formation across parade grounds that seem to extend to the horizon. Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois processed 20,000 new recruits every month through basic training programs that lasted 8 weeks. 8 weeks to transform civilians into sailors ready for technical school assignments. Hundreds of bunks packed close together, recruits sleep, equipment stowed in lockers, uniforms hanging in precise order. The Japanese couldn't conceive of training at this scale. Their entire cultural and institutional framework emphasized careful development of professional personnel over years of service. The idea of taking civilians and turning them into functional sailors in 2 months contradicted everything Japanese naval culture understood about creating effective personnel. 50 recruits sit at desks taking notes, while an instructor points to a blackboard covered with diagrams of ship systems and mechanical components. After basic training came technical schools, radio men, gunner's mates, machinists' mates, fire controlmen, sonar operators, radar technicians, hundreds of different ratings all being trained simultaneously at facilities across the country. And Great Lakes was just one training facility. Newport, San Diego, Norfolk, Pensacola, multiple installations each processing similar numbers. And for every ship sliding down the ways, there were crews already training to man them, not selected carefully over years, not drawn from a limited pool of professional sailors, recruited from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit and high schools in Texas. Civilians who'd never seen the ocean, transformed into sailors in months, then assigned to vessels that hadn't even been launched yet. Captain Omei sits at his desk, reading a translated American technical journal, the Naval Institute Proceedings. He makes notes as he reads. Japanese intelligence officers had access to much of this information. American technical publications documented training facilities and construction programs. The information was published openly in journals that Japanese officers read regularly. The statistics were available, but Omei and his colleagues couldn't understand what they were reading. They saw expansion of training facilities and interpreted it through a Japanese lens, modest, gradual increase in capacity. They couldn't conceive that expansion meant multiplying capacity by factors of 10 or 20, not doubling or tripling. The actual expansion at Great Lakes alone would add capacity for 240,000 new sailors per year. Omei estimated 15,000 to 20,000 over 18 months. He was wrong by a factor of more than 20 to 1, and he was looking directly at information that should have told him the truth. But having information is not the same as understanding it, and understanding requires the ability to conceive of possibilities beyond your own experience. Japanese naval officers had spent their entire careers in a system that expanded slowly and carefully. They could not imagine a system that operated on fundamentally different principles at fundamentally different scales. Why did intelligent, experienced officers all make the same fundamental error? The answer lies in what intelligence professionals call mirror imaging. Mirror imaging is the assumption that the enemy thinks like you do, operates like you do, and values the same things you do. The Japanese looked at American naval practices through a Japanese lens and saw what they expected to see. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized elite crews operating complex vessels with maximum efficiency, quality over quantity. Every sailor was carefully selected, extensively trained, and expected to maintain high performance standards throughout their career. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not use reservists in significant numbers. They did not conduct mass recruiting campaigns. They did not believe in taking civilians and turning them into sailors in a matter of months. Their entire cultural and institutional framework emphasized careful development of professional personnel over years of service. Their peacetime navy of approximately 120,000 men would expand to only 300,000 by the end of the war. A threefold increase over 4 years was considered rapid expansion by Japanese standards. They assumed the American approach would be similar. They assumed that building a navy required the same careful, methodical approach that Japan used. They were projecting their own limitations onto an enemy with completely different capabilities and completely different assumptions about how to mobilize a nation for war. The reality of American naval expansion was something Japanese intelligence had no context to imagine. In June 1941, the United States Navy had approximately 284,000 active duty personnel. This included officers, enlisted personnel, nurses, and support staff across all naval installations worldwide. 18 months later, in December 1942, that number had grown to 1,640,000. By December 1943, it reached 2,374,094. The growth was not linear, it was exponential. The rate of expansion accelerated as training facilities expanded, recruitment intensified, and the entire American industrial and social system oriented toward war production. The Japanese had studied American shipyards and knew the United States could build vessels faster than Japan. American construction statistics were published in trade journals and technical publications that Japanese intelligence officers read regularly. What they failed to understand was that America could simultaneously recruit, train, and deploy the personnel to operate those vessels at a pace that no other nation could match. The United States was not constrained by available manpower. The country had 131 million people in 1941. Approximately 50 million were men of military age. Even accounting for agricultural deferments to maintain food production, essential industry exemptions to keep factories running, and physical disqualifications for health reasons, the pool of potential recruits was effectively unlimited. The Japanese Imperial Navy was drawing from a population of 73 million, with far more rigid social constraints on who could serve. Women were not considered for naval service, except in very limited administrative roles. Social class distinctions limited opportunities for many potential recruits. Educational requirements were strict. The mathematics of the situation should have been obvious. A nation with twice the population and far fewer social restrictions on military service could mobilize far more personnel. But intelligence analysis is not about what should be obvious. It is about what analysts are prepared to see. And Japanese analysts were not prepared to see an enemy that could expand its navy tenfold in less than 4 years. December 7, 1941, seemed to confirm everything Japanese intelligence had calculated. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans killed. The Pacific Fleet crippled. For Japanese planners, this was proof their strategy would work. But within a week, something Japanese planners hadn't anticipated began. Salvage operations on a scale Japan couldn't match. 500 men assigned to salvage a single ship. 300 divers rotating in shifts. Machine shops fabricating custom patches and pumps. Every salvage expert in the Pacific Fleet concentrated at Pearl Harbor, with more arriving every week from the mainland. Japanese intelligence had assumed American salvage capability was similar to Japan's, small specialist teams working methodically with limited resources. They couldn't imagine America would assign 500 men to salvage a single ship. In Japan's Navy, that many salvage specialists didn't exist in the entire service. In Tokyo, intelligence officers reviewed damage reports from Pearl Harbor and calculated American recovery time. Using Japanese standards for repair work and personnel availability, they estimated 12 to 18 months before the Americans could restore equivalent combat power, possibly longer if material shortages affected repair work. The predictions were based on Japanese understanding of how navies worked. Damage this severe would take Japan 12 to 18 months to repair, maybe longer. Therefore, it would take America 12 to 18 months. But America didn't work like Japan. America didn't repair slowly and carefully with limited personnel and constrained resources. America threw unlimited manpower at every problem and solved through overwhelming force of numbers. And it wasn't just Pearl Harbor. Every shipyard on the West Coast received authorization to expand. Every training facility doubled, then tripled capacity. Every recruiting office stayed open 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Japanese had attacked what they thought was a constrained, limited enemy. What they'd actually done was awaken an industrial democracy mobilizing for total war with resources Japan couldn't begin to match. And for 11 more months, Japanese intelligence would continue believing their estimates were accurate. 11 months, while the truth grew larger and more catastrophic with each passing week. 11 months until field commanders began sending reports that didn't match the intelligence estimates. Reports that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with everything Tokyo believed about American strength. Standard Japanese doctrine called for approximately 2,000 personnel to operate a fleet carrier, including the embarked air wing. 2 carriers meant roughly 4,000 American sailors in the immediate operational area. This was consistent with intelligence estimates and Japanese experience. But radio intercept specialists monitoring American communications detected something unexpected. References to multiple task group commanders, extensive logistic ships providing underway replenishment, screening forces far larger than expected for a 2-carrier force. The intercepts revealed a complexity to American force structure that didn't match Japanese models. Too many command elements, too many support vessels, too many screening destroyers and cruisers for just 2 carriers. The after-action analysis estimated American personnel in the operational area at between 7,000 and 9,000 for 2 carriers. That ratio was wrong. It suggested manning levels nearly double what Japanese planners had assumed. The intelligence was noted but dismissed. Task force commanders operate with different philosophies. Perhaps the Americans were simply less efficient with their personnel allocation. Perhaps they were overstaffed because of inexperience. The warning sign was ignored. The institutional culture made it easier to assume American inefficiency than to question fundamental estimates that had been validated at the highest levels. Challenging those estimates would require evidence far more substantial than a single battle's personnel counts, and that evidence was about to arrive. June 1942, 1 month later. The Battle of Midway. The second indication came in June 1942 at Midway. The battle was a disaster for Japan. 4 fleet carriers sunk: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Over 3,000 personnel killed. The loss of highly trained pilots and maintenance crews that could never be replaced. But what shocked Japanese intelligence officers afterward was not the tactical outcome. Battles are won and lost. What shocked them was the American damage control performance. The carrier Yorktown absorbed multiple bomb hits and torpedo strikes. It should have sunk immediately based on Japanese understanding of carrier vulnerability. Instead, American damage control parties kept the ship operational for hours. The carrier was hit by 3 bombs around noon on June 4th. The ship was dead in the water by 2:40 in the afternoon, with fires burning, flight deck damaged, and power systems offline. Within 2 hours, damage control teams had restored power, patched flight deck holes with steel plates, and brought the ship to 20 knots from 0. The carrier resumed air operations by 4 in the afternoon, launching and recovering aircraft as if the earlier damage had been minor. Japanese observers watching from reconnaissance aircraft couldn't understand what they were seeing. A carrier that should have been sinking was launching aircraft. The damage control capability seemed impossible. Japanese damage control doctrine relied on small, highly trained specialist teams working with minimal redundancy. The Americans seemed to have dozens of damage control personnel available on a single vessel, with backup teams ready to take over if primary teams were incapacitated. Omae examines a document, the Yorktown's crew list, recovered from materials found floating after the battle, finally sank following additional torpedo hits. Where did all those people come from? A Japanese fleet carrier operated with approximately 1,500 crew. Intelligence estimates had suggested American carriers had similar manning, perhaps slightly higher, but the Yorktown's crew list showed over 2,200 names. The crew list document, showing columns of names, page after page of personnel assigned to a single vessel. The Americans were putting nearly 50% more personnel on their carriers than Japanese planners had assumed. That meant 50% more damage control capability, 50% more maintenance capacity, 50% more sustained operations capability, 50% more everything. Omae sets down the crew list and picks up a summary report he's been preparing. He writes a conclusion in careful Japanese characters. The implications were enormous. If manning estimates for carriers were wrong by 50%, what about other vessel types? If the Americans could put 2,200 crew on a carrier instead of 1,500, they could field fewer ships with the same total personnel, or they had far more personnel than estimates suggested. Omae finishes writing his conclusion, reads it over carefully, then sets down his pen. He submitted a revised estimate to senior leadership suggesting American carrier manning might be significantly higher than previously calculated. The report recommended reviewing personnel estimates for all American vessel classes to determine if similar discrepancies existed. Omae places the report in a folder marked Urgent Personnel Estimate Revision and hands it to an aide. The report was received, reviewed, and filed. The recommendation to conduct a comprehensive review of American manning standards was noted for future consideration. Operations planning continued using existing estimates. The warning was acknowledged but not acted upon. And still, Tokyo headquarters did not adjust their fundamental estimates of American naval strength. Adjusting those estimates would require admitting that strategic planning for the entire war had been based on faulty intelligence. It would require explaining to field commanders why the assumptions they'd been given were wrong. It would require revising operational plans already in execution. The aide carries Omae's report down a hallway, enters another office, and places it in an inbox already stacked with dozens of other reports, all waiting for review, all competing for attention. The institutional inertia was too great. Better to assume the Yorktown was an anomaly, overstaffed for some unknown American reason, than to question the foundation of Japan's entire strategic calculus. The third warning came in August 1942, during the Guadalcanal campaign, the first major American offensive operation. Japanese intelligence had estimated that American forces in the South Pacific would be limited by personnel availability. They expected perhaps 2 or 3 reinforced battalions, maybe 8,000 to 10,000 men total for an initial landing operation. Marine forces landed with 11,000 troops on Guadalcanal alone, with additional forces landing on nearby Talagi and other islands. The total American ground force commitment to the Solomon Islands operation exceeded 16,000 personnel. Naval forces supporting the landing included 3 aircraft carriers, a battleship, 14 cruisers, and 31 destroyers. The personnel required to operate and support that force exceeded 30,000 sailors, not counting the merchant marine crews manning transport vessels. American ground forces received continuous resupply from transport vessels crewed by merchant marine personnel who had been rapidly trained and deployed in a matter of months rather than years. Japanese submarines patrolling the supply routes watched convoys moving supplies to Guadalcanal and reported supply ship traffic at levels that seemed impossible for a navy Tokyo believed had fewer than 400,000 total personnel. Submarine commanders sent detailed reports to Tokyo. 20 transport vessels in a single convoy, another 15 2 days later, another 12 3 days after that. The mathematics didn't work. Each transport required a crew of 40 to 50 merchant sailors. Each escort destroyer required 300 naval personnel. The numbers kept adding up to totals that exceeded intelligence estimates. Admiral Isororuku Yamamoto sits at his desk, reading reports from Guadalcanal. His expression is troubled. He's older than most of the officers we've seen, in his late 50s, gray-haired, with the weathered face of a man who has spent decades at sea. The Americans were operating a major offensive campaign in the Solomon Islands while simultaneously maintaining Atlantic convoy operations against German submarines, conducting training exercises to prepare new units for deployment, and building crews for vessels under construction. Yamamoto sets down the reports and picks up a personnel estimate document, the same estimates we've seen before, showing 296,000 enlisted personnel projected for December 1943. The math did not work. Either Japanese intelligence numbers were fundamentally wrong, or the Americans had found some way to multiply their available manpower beyond any reasonable calculation. Yamamoto studies the document for a long moment, his expression grave. He picks up a pen and begins writing, a personal cable to Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. By early 1943, field commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports to Tokyo. Admiral Isororuku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, personally sent a cable to Naval General Staff Headquarters questioning the intelligence estimates. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921 and had served as naval attaché in Washington during the 1920s. He knew America better than most Japanese officers. He understood American industrial capacity and organizational capability from direct observation. He had walked American streets, visited American factories, and talked with American engineers and businessmen. He had seen American mass production firsthand, assembly lines producing automobiles by the thousands, not by the dozens, factories that operated 3 shifts around the clock, an industrial culture built on standardization, efficiency, and scale that Japan couldn't match. His cable was blunt and undiplomatic. American naval forces in the Pacific had grown to levels that were incompatible with pre-war intelligence projections. Either the Americans had stripped the Atlantic theater bare of all naval forces and concentrated everything in the Pacific, which seemed unlikely given the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic, or the personnel estimates that had informed Japanese strategic planning were fundamentally wrong. Tokyo needed to determine which scenario was correct and adjust planning accordingly. The situation could not continue with field commanders operating on assumptions that no longer matched observed reality. Men were dying, ships were being sunk, battles were being lost, and all of it might be happening because headquarters was operating with intelligence estimates that bore no relationship to actual enemy strength. The request was assigned to intelligence officers in the Naval Intelligence Division who specialized in American naval analysis. They were ordered to conduct a comprehensive review of all available intelligence and determine actual American strength from observed deployments rather than theoretical projections. They pulled every report from the past 18 months and started calculating. American ship sightings from submarine patrols and reconnaissance flights, radio intercepts revealing call signs and unit designations, prisoner interrogations providing direct testimony about unit sizes and manning levels, captured documents showing organizational structures and personnel allocations. They counted every vessel reported in the Pacific Theater and calculated minimum crew requirements based on vessel type and mission. Aircraft carriers, 2,000 to 2,500 personnel each, based on revised estimates from Midway analysis. Battleships, 2,500 to 3,000. Cruisers, 1,000 to 1,500. Destroyers, 300 to 400. Submarines, 80 to 100. Support vessels, transports, auxiliaries, all calculated with standard crew complements. Then they added Atlantic operations visible through intelligence collection, convoy escorts operating between the United States and Britain, dozens of destroyers, destroyer escorts, and corvettes, carrier groups supporting amphibious operations in North Africa, training commands preparing new units on both coasts, shore stations providing maintenance, repair, and logistics support. The preliminary totals came to over 850,000 personnel. That was already more than double the official estimates that had been used for war planning. But the analysis was not finished. When American manning standards documented in captured operations manuals were applied to the observed ship counts, the total rose to 1,200,000. And this was just active operational forces. It did not include the training pipeline of recruits undergoing basic training, technical schools preparing specialists, advanced training units working up for deployment, or the vast shore establishment of administrative and support personnel required to sustain operations.
Intelligence officers wrote detailed reports concluding that Japanese intelligence estimates of American naval manpower were low by a factor of at least 3 to 1, possibly 4 to 1, or even higher. The error was not marginal, it was catastrophic. Every strategic assumption, every operational plan, every calculated risk had been based on numbers that were wrong by factors measured in hundreds of percentage points. The reports were submitted to senior leadership in the spring of 1943. They were read, questioned, and extensively debated. American expansion at such rates seemed impossible to officers who had spent their careers in a navy that grew slowly and carefully, one ship and one sailor at a time. The cultural assumption that mobilization had natural limits colored every analysis. The idea that America could train hundreds of thousands of sailors in months rather than years contradicted everything Japanese naval culture understood about creating effective personnel. Training took time. Developing competence required experience. Building unit cohesion demanded careful selection and prolonged service together. The American approach of rapid mass mobilization seemed likely to produce poorly trained personnel operating at low efficiency. How could such a force be effective in combat? The question revealed the depth of the cultural misunderstanding. The Americans weren't trying to create elite professionals through years of careful development. They were creating functional specialists through intensive short-term training, accepting lower individual skill levels, but compensating through overwhelming numbers and organizational redundancy. It was a fundamentally different model of naval warfare, one that Japanese culture and doctrine had no framework to comprehend or counter. Quality versus quantity was a false choice when the enemy could produce both quality enough and quantity unlimited. In July 1943, a captured American sailor provided dramatic confirmation that changed the nature of the debate. The sailor was a radio operator from a destroyer sunk off Kolombangara during a night surface engagement. He was young, recently trained, and remarkably forthcoming during interrogation. Japanese interrogators often found American prisoners more willing to talk than their own personnel would have been in similar circumstances. The cultural differences extended even to captivity. American sailors,
trained in a democratic society that valued individual life, saw survival as pragmatic rather than shameful. Japanese military culture viewed capture as dishonor worse than death. The sailor told his interrogators about his training experience. Boot camp at Great Lakes, Illinois. 8 weeks of basic training. He had trained with 4,000 other recruits in his company alone. Thousands of men processing through standardized training programs designed to create functional sailors as quickly as possible. The interrogation officer asked him to repeat that number, certain there had been a translation error. 4,000 recruits in a single training company? The sailor confirmed. Sometimes 5,000 when the facility was running at maximum capacity. Then the sailor mentioned something even more shocking. The facility processed 20,000 new sailors every month through basic training programs. 20,000 per month meant 240,000 new sailors per year from a single training facility. That was training capacity alone, producing raw recruits ready for technical school assignments. It did not include officer candidate schools training ensigns and junior grade lieutenants. It did not include specialized technical schools training radiomen, gunner's mates, machinist mates, and other ratings. It did not include advanced training facilities working up flight crews, submarine crews, and specialized units. The sailor mentioned casually that he had friends training in 3 other major facilities around the country with similar capacity: San Diego, Norfolk, and Newport. If each facility processed similar numbers, the Americans were adding close to 1 million new sailors per year to their personnel system. 1 million per year. The number was staggering, impossible, unbelievable. The interrogation report made it to Tokyo in August 1943. It was read by senior intelligence officers, including Captain Omai. It was filed with supporting documentation, and once again it was questioned rather than fully accepted. The prisoner was probably exaggerating to impress his captors. He was probably confused about the actual numbers. He might have misunderstood what he was told during training. Prisoners say things for many reasons: seeking favorable treatment, trying to demoralize their captors, simply misremembering details under stress. The information was noted as potentially significant, but not verified through independent sources and therefore not fully reliable for planning purposes. The institutional resistance to accepting uncomfortable truths remained powerful. Accepting these numbers would mean accepting that every estimate, every plan, every strategic calculation for the past 2 years had been catastrophically wrong. The human mind resists information that contradicts deeply held beliefs. Intelligence officers are trained to be skeptical, to demand multiple independent sources, to question single-source reporting. All of these are good practices, but they can also become mechanisms for dismissing unwelcome truths when those truths threaten the foundation of everything you believe. The verification came from an unexpected source that could not be easily dismissed. In September 1943, a German submarine operating in the Atlantic transmitted a detailed report to Berlin describing convoy escort operations observed during a multi-day patrol. The report included technical observations of American destroyer escorts, their tactical performance, crew organization, and manning levels. These were the new destroyer escorts America was producing in massive numbers specifically for convoy protection. German naval intelligence shared the report with their Japanese counterparts through the military attaché in Berlin as part of routine intelligence exchange between Axis powers. The Germans thought they were sharing a tactical curiosity. They had no idea they were providing confirmation of Japanese intelligence services' worst fears. The German submarine commander had observed American destroyer escorts during a surface engagement and had counted personnel visible on deck during action stations. He estimated the American destroyer escort carried a crew of approximately 180 to 200 personnel. Japanese destroyer escorts of comparable size operated with crews of 100 to 120. The American vessels were not significantly larger in displacement or dimensions. They were simply more heavily manned, 60% to 80% more personnel performing the same functions. The Germans noted this as an operational curiosity worth sharing. American destroyer escorts seemed to have larger crews than expected, which might explain their effective anti-submarine performance. For Japanese analysts, it was confirmation of a pattern they had been reluctant to acknowledge. If the Americans were putting 50% to 80% more crew on their escort vessels, they were probably doing the same across their entire fleet. Carriers with 50% more crew, battleships with 50% more crew, cruisers and destroyers and auxiliaries, all carrying more personnel than Japanese estimates assumed. Omai begins recalculating. If every American vessel has 50% to 80% more crew than estimated, and they're fielding the observed number of vessels, then total personnel must be... The implications were staggering. Every Japanese calculation about American fleet size, operational capability, and sustainability was based on manning assumptions that were demonstrably wrong. Not wrong by 10 or 20%, wrong by factors of 50% to 80% or more. If personnel estimates were wrong by that magnitude, then every derivative calculation was equally wrong. The number of task forces America could field, the number of simultaneous operations they could conduct, their ability to sustain combat losses and continue fighting, their capacity to expand further. Everything was wrong. September 1943 was the month Tokyo finally, quietly, began to acknowledge they had a fundamental problem with their understanding of American capabilities. Not a small error that could be corrected with minor adjustments. A fundamental failure of analysis that invalidated true years of strategic planning. A working group was formed in the Naval Intelligence Division specifically to reassess American personnel strength using all available information without regard to whether the conclusions fit existing assumptions. The group included experienced intelligence officers and operations planners. They were given access to classified files from multiple sources and told to develop new estimates based on comprehensive analysis rather than incremental adjustments to old estimates. They worked for 6 weeks examining every piece of evidence systematically. Every submarine patrol report from 1942 and 1943. Every radio intercept log. Every prisoner interrogation transcript. Every captured document. The German report on destroyer escort manning. The Yorktown crew list from Midway. Force composition analyses from every major engagement. They cross-referenced information from multiple sources to verify accuracy. A submarine might cite a specific destroyer. Radio intercepts would confirm that destroyer's call sign and unit assignment. A prisoner might mention serving in that unit, providing details about crew size and operational tempo. Captured documents would show the destroyer's organizational placement and support structure. Each piece of information validated and reinforced the others. Their report was submitted on November 9, 1943. The new estimate placed American naval personnel strength at approximately 1,800,000 as of mid-1943, with projected growth to 2,400,000 by mid-1944, based on observed expansion rates. This was still conservative compared to actual American strength. The working group hedged their estimates, reluctant to present numbers that seemed too extreme, even when evidence supported higher figures. The actual American strength in November 1943 was approximately 2,100,000, 300,000 more than even this revised estimate suggested. But it was close enough to reality that the strategic implications could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The error wasn't marginal. It wasn't a matter of adjusting plans at the edges. The error was fundamental and catastrophic. The report included a detailed appendix analyzing what these revised numbers meant for Japanese war planning and strategic assumptions. The analysis was methodical and devastating. If the Americans had nearly 2 million sailors currently in service, with expansion continuing, they could simultaneously operate major fleet concentrations in multiple theaters without mutual support or resource sharing between theaters. The Pacific Fleet and Atlantic Fleet weren't competing for limited personnel. Both were being fully manned from an apparently inexhaustible pool of trained sailors. They could conduct unrestricted offensive operations in the Pacific while maintaining full-strength convoy escort operations in the Atlantic. They could sustain combat losses at rates Japan could never match and still expand total force strength month over month. They could maintain extensive logistics